He woke before the castle did. That was the first thing he noticed. How absolute the quiet was. How perfectly still the dormitory had gone in the hours before dawn. 5 beds, 5 sleeping boys, and not a sound except for Seamus's uneven breathing, 2 beds over, and the low, intermittent creak of old timber settling somewhere in the walls. Harry lay on his back and stared up at the canopy above him, and did not move. His right hand was aching. Not badly. The worst it had been was the second week of September. 3 sessions in succession. Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, when the skin had not yet had time to close properly between visits, and the quill had found the same grooves and deepened them. What he had now was a residual thing, a dull pulse that lived just below the surface of the letters, and reminded him, periodically, that they were there. He had learned to register it the way he registered the scar on his forehead. A familiar signal, something to note, not something to show. He turned his right hand over on the bedclothes and looked at it. I must not tell lies. The words were pale in the near dark. He had to angle his hand toward the window to see them properly, the faint grey beginning of dawn just barely touching the glass. They had not faded in the week since September. He had believed, at first, that they would, that this would heal the way most things healed, that a night's sleep or a muttered charm would restore the skin to what it had been before. He had stopped believing that by the 3rd week. The letters had settled in. They were not healing. They were simply his hand now, the way the scar was simply his forehead. He had not told anyone. He had not told Ron, who was sleeping in the next bed, with one long arm thrown over his face and his feet hanging off the end of the mattress. He had not told Hermione, who would have found references within an hour, and then looked at him with an expression he didn't know what to do with. He had not, above all, told the headmaster. And this silence had a different texture than the others, because for the others he could construct a practical reason. Don't cause a scene. Wait for the right moment. For the headmaster, the reason that surfaced when he looked at it directly was simpler and harder. He wasn't sure it would help. He sat up slowly. The dormitory was dark and familiar around him. He had woken in this room for 4 years. He knew the shape of it without seeing it, knew which floorboard would hold his weight silently, and which would not, knew the particular cold that settled in the upper levels of the castle in the hours before the fires were lit. Ron didn't stir. From somewhere below, the castle made its sound. Old stone doing what old stone did. A creak here, a low resonance there, the building breathing in its own language. Harry had grown used to it. Tonight it felt less like atmosphere and more like company. He thought about the weeks in September. The first detention had been 9 days into term, after he had contradicted Umbridge in class, told her plainly that Voldemort had returned and that Cedric was dead. She had listened to all of this with her hands folded on her desk and a smile that did not involve her eyes, and had then informed him, in the same pleasant voice she used for everything, that he would report to her office at 5 o'clock. He had gone. He had sat down at the small table she indicated. She had placed a quill in his hand and gestured at the parchment. She told him to write, "I must not tell lies," and the quill had begun its work. He had not understood at first what was happening. Then he had. She had told him at the end of that first session that he was not to speak of the instrument, the inscription, or the detention to either the school matron or the headmaster. She said it pleasantly, as though offering helpful guidance. He had walked back to Gryffindor Tower with his right hand wrapped in a fold of his robes, and said nothing to anyone. He had returned for the next detention, and the one after. This was the thing he had not let himself look at directly, not once across all these weeks. Why? He got out of bed. The floor was cold under his bare feet. He crossed to the window and stood there in the dark, not turning on any light, looking out at what could be seen of the grounds below. The black edge of the forest, the invisible lake. It was the hour before colour had returned to anything, the hour when the grounds were more theoretical than real. He wasn't seeing it particularly. He was trying to see the answer. He had said nothing, because saying it out loud would require him to acknowledge something he had been avoiding for months. That somewhere beneath the practical reasons, don't give her the satisfaction, don't escalate, wait until you understand the situation better. There was a worse reason, that he had stayed silent across 4 weeks of those evenings because he was no longer entirely certain that telling the people who were supposed to help would actually produce help. That the list of people he trusted to act on this, when he surveyed it honestly, had been getting shorter for some time. He thought about the 12th of August, the full Wizengamot in Courtroom 10, Level 10, Ministry of Magic. 50 members in their plum-coloured robes. He had gone in expecting something small and administrative and found the entire court assembled, and Fudge at the centre with the particular expression of a man who has already made his decision and finds the proceedings a useful formality. Harry had been 15 years old with his wand and no one on his side, and then Dumbledore had arrived. He had produced Mrs. Fig and spoken crisply and prepared the appropriate counter to every move Fudge made, and Harry had been acquitted. He remembered the relief of it very precisely, sudden and physical, like warmth after cold. He also remembered watching Dumbledore walk away down the corridor afterward, not looking back, not stopping, not speaking to Harry at all. He had told himself it meant nothing, that the headmaster had obligations, that a ministry corridor after a public hearing was not the right place, that there would be a moment later when Dumbledore would sit down with him and say, "Here is what I know. Here is what I'm doing. Here is why I haven't been able to tell you any of it yet." He had been telling himself some version of this for the better part of a year. He was still telling himself it. He was simply getting tired of the way it sounded. He thought about the summer. 10 weeks in the house on Privet Drive, in the smallest bedroom, knowing nothing and not being trusted to know it. The letters that arrived with news carefully drained out of them. He understood there were reasons. He spent 10 weeks understanding them with his hands flat on his thighs, while Vernon said whatever Vernon said, and the news on the telly showed no sign that anything was happening. And there had been no particular moment when understanding it had made it easier to bear. He was standing at the window, and something in him had gone very still. It was not anger, exactly. He had been angry before, and knew the specific quality of it. This was different. Quieter. It was the feeling of having held a position for a long time and simply letting it down, not in defeat, but with the particular clarity of a person who has finally stopped pretending that waiting is the same as having a plan. He turned from the window. He crossed back to the trunk at the foot of his bed and lifted the lid. Robes, textbooks, the photograph album he had mostly stopped opening because it made something in his chest do something he didn't have room for right now. He moved these aside. At the bottom, where he had put it in September, was a clean roll of parchment, and beside it, his own quill, not the one she had given him. His. He held both for a moment. He was the structure in place. He had known that, in some part of himself, since he was 11 years old. He just hadn't thought to apply it here. He carried the parchment and quill to the small desk by the window. He sat down. He looked out at the first pale line of grey beginning to separate the forest from the sky above it. The grounds were still dark. The castle was still quiet. Beside him, Ron breathed the even, unconscious breath of someone for whom this morning had not yet begun. Harry thought about what he was going to write. The sky beyond the window was still mostly dark. Harry dipped the quill, his own, the brass-nibbed one, from his trunk, and wrote the first line. He was formal about it. That was the decision he had made in the hours before he sat down. This would be a document, not a confession. He would use the language of institutions because institutions were what he was writing to. He would not tell them how he felt. He would tell them what had happened. The withdrawal was the first thing. He wrote it plainly. A formal withdrawal from Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, submitted by Harry James Potter, age 15, effective at the submission of this letter. He did not explain why in the first line. First lines were not for explaining. They were for stating. He moved on. The blood quill was the second thing. He had thought, in the weeks of not telling anyone, that putting it into words would be the hardest part. He had imagined it would feel like pulling something loose, like reopening something he'd worked to seal. What it felt like, instead, was relief. The particular, slightly startling relief of a thing described after a long time spent not describing it. He kept his handwriting even. He stated, the detentions had begun in September 1995, the first week of term, in the office of the Defense Against the Dark Arts professor on the first floor of Hogwarts Castle. He had been ordered to write lines. The instrument used was a black quill, not a standard quill. The instrument wrote in the user's own blood, carving each letter directly into the skin of the writer's right hand. He had attended a total of 9 sessions across 5 weeks. The sessions had ranged from a single hour to approximately 3 hours in duration. The physical consequence was a permanent inscription on the back of his right hand, reading, "I must not tell lies." The inscription had not healed and was not expected to heal. He paused. He looked at his right hand in the grey early light. He had been explicitly instructed at the close of the first session that he was not to seek medical attention for his hand and was not to inform the headmaster of Hogwarts of the detentions, their content, or the instrument used. He wrote this down. He stated that he had complied with this instruction for 5 weeks. He stated that the scarring on his right hand was visible and could be examined by any qualified medical person as physical evidence, and that he intended to present it as such. He set the quill down. He flexed his right hand once and then straightened it on the desk. He picked the quill back up. The guardianship was the third thing, and it was the one he'd had the most difficulty deciding to include, because including it meant admitting that he had only recently understood what had been wrong with his situation. He had known something was off since he was 13. He understood it clearly now. He wrote without apology. He stated that his parents, James Potter and Lily Potter, had prepared a will prior to their deaths on the 31st of October, 1981. He stated that the will had named a specific guardian for him, Sirius Black. He wrote the name carefully. He had been placed instead with his maternal aunt and uncle, Petunia Dursley and Vernon Dursley, by arrangement of Albus Dumbledore, headmaster of Hogwarts. This arrangement had not followed the terms of his parents' will. He noted, because it was relevant, that Sirius Black had been imprisoned in Azkaban in 1981 without being brought before the Wizengamot. No trial had taken place. He had not been convicted. He had simply been sent. He wrote this carefully, testing the facts against what Sirius had told him in Year 3, and what had been said since across various conversations that had never, at the time, seemed like things he should write down. The facts held. He stated that, at the time of the imprisonment, Albus Dumbledore had held the position of Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot. He stated that there was no ministry record. He crossed that out. That was presumption He didn't know what records the ministry held or didn't hold. He rewrote. He stated that there was no record, to his knowledge, that the chief warlock had taken any action to ensure that a trial was convened. He was therefore requesting that the Department of Magical Law Enforcement review two matters: the placement of Harry Potter with the Dursley family, which had not followed the terms of a legally executed will, and the imprisonment of Sirius Black, which had occurred without trial or conviction. He wrote the last section slowly. It was the hardest to phrase without it sounding like a complaint, and he didn't want it to sound like a complaint. He wanted it to sound like what it was. He sat with the quill unmoving for a moment, and then wrote. Throughout the 5th year of his attendance at Hogwarts, the headmaster of Hogwarts had withheld from him basic information about his own circumstances. He had not been informed of the terms of his parents' will, or of the circumstances of his designated guardian's imprisonment. He had not been told the nature of the threat currently directed at him, a threat the headmaster had evidently been managing through concealment rather than disclosure, to an extent that Harry was only now beginning to understand. He could not enumerate everything that had been withheld, because he did not know the full extent of what he had not been told. He stated that the pattern itself was the concern, that a student under this institution's care had been kept, systematically, and over a period of years, in ignorance of decisions that shaped his life. He was not asking the headmaster to account for himself to Harry. He was asking the ministry to note that a student withdrawing from a school under ministry oversight had done so in part because the institution had not treated him as a person who was owed an account of his own situation. He stopped there. He read it back once. He changed 2 words. It would hold. He counted the sheets. He had used more parchment than he'd expected. His handwriting had tightened as he went, the way it always did when he was concentrating. He found 2 more clean sheets and copied the letter twice over, line by line, in the same even hand. His right hand ached during the 3rd copy. He kept going. When the copies were finished, he sat back and looked at them, spread across the narrow desk. The sky outside had changed while he worked. It was no longer black. It had moved through shades of very dark blue toward something that was almost faintly grey. Below, the grounds were beginning to have shape again, the tree line picking itself out from the sky, the lake becoming distinct from the surrounding darkness. He folded each letter in thirds. The copy for the headmaster's office he sealed with plain wax. The copy for the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, Ministry of Magic, London. He sealed with 2 passes of the wax and wrote across the outside, in careful block letters, marked urgent. The 3rd copy he sealed and did not address. He held it for a moment. Then he slipped it into the inside pocket of his robes. He had made 3 copies because one of them had to be his. From somewhere below the tower, the castle was beginning to stir. A door, a pair of footsteps that passed and faded. Ron had not moved in his bed. He was still turned toward the wall with one arm over his face, breathing slowly. Harry stood up from the desk and looked at the 2 addressed letters in his hands. He had written the name Sirius Black in his own handwriting. He had written the words, "I mustn't tell lies," in the same document, where he also wrote the words, "I intend to present my hand as evidence." He had named the headmaster. He had named the will and the trial that never happened, and the 14 years of a living arrangement that had not followed any legal instruction his parents had left. He had named all of it, on paper, in his own hand, the same hand that bore the marks. And now it would go to people who had the power to respond to it or not respond to it, and either way it would exist. It was not silence anymore. He was not going to change his mind. He picked up the letters and left. The owlery was cold at that hour, and smelled exactly the way it always did: straw and feathers, and something that required a specific tolerance. Harry climbed the last of the stairs in the grey before dawn light, and stopped for a moment on the threshold to let his eyes adjust. Dozens of owls shifted on their perches. They regarded him with the mild, contemptuous patience of creatures who had been here considerably longer than he had. He chose 2 of the school's tawny owls. They were solid birds, used to long runs. He'd seen them dispatched to the ministry before with official Hogwarts correspondence. He tied the London letter to the first one's leg. The letter for the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, sealed twice, with marked urgent across the outside, and carried the owl to the open window. It stepped onto the sill. It looked at him once, with the flat, assessing expression owls used when confirming they understood the destination, and then dropped away into the air and was gone. South. He watched until he couldn't see it anymore. The second owl he brought to the wall niche at the far end of the owlery, where a cluster of smaller school owls handled internal Hogwarts delivery, timetables at the start of term, summonses to the headmaster's office, the occasional official communication that needed to reach somewhere in the castle without the sender making the journey themselves. He attached the headmaster's letter to the second owl's leg and pointed it at the interior slot, and stepped back. There was a brief shuffling of wings, and then the sound of something moving inside the wall, diminishing, and then silence. The letters were gone. Harry had perhaps 3 minutes before the corridors would start filling with first years heading to breakfast. He went. The great hall had its morning noise: benches scraping, toast racks being passed, the low, persistent clatter of 400 people who hadn't been awake long enough to be their full selves. Harry found his usual place at the Gryffindor table. Ron was already there, red-haired and rumpled, and working through a considerable pile of eggs. Hermione sat across from them both, with a book propped against the orange juice, which was the compromise she had arrived at somewhere in year 2, between reading at meals and not reading at meals. Harry sat down. He reached for the toast. "Morning," Ron said, without looking up. "Morning," Harry said. That was roughly the extent of it. Ron went back to his eggs. Hermione turned a page. Harry ate his toast, and then reached for the porridge, and ate some of that as well, and the ordinary sounds of morning continued around them. There was a moment when Hermione put down her book and looked at him. Not suspiciously, not with any particular theory, just looked, the way she did when she was running her usual calibration on the people around her. And then she picked the book back up without saying anything. He was grateful for that. Whatever she had calibrated, she'd decided it could wait. Ron noticed that Harry was eating without looking up. It wasn't like Harry to eat without occasionally complaining about the eggs, or asking Ron how much homework was actually left from Snape, or making some remark about how early defense seemed to get scheduled every week. Ron noted this and filed it, and said nothing. It wasn't the kind of morning that invited saying things. The owls came in during the second cup of tea. The Morning Post, a sweep of wings overhead, hundreds of them distributing newspapers and packages and letters across the 4 long tables with the calm efficiency of a system that had been running for several centuries. Harry watched the flock move overhead without appearing to watch it. None of the post was for him. The Daily Prophet landed in front of Hermione, and she unfolded it and began reading. Harry's eyes moved back to his porridge bowl and stayed there. He was beginning to understand what it felt like to have done something that could not be undone. Defense against the dark arts was first period. Harry collected his bag and walked with Ron and Hermione and the rest of the 5th years from the Great Hall up through the castle to the 1st floor, and took his seat in the classroom without any particular urgency. This was itself notable, because for the past 5 weeks, entering this room had produced a specific quality of dread in him, a careful flatness the sustained equivalent of a held breath. He had spent 5 weeks in this classroom, not letting his right hand show, and not meeting her eyes for too long, and not saying anything that would add another session to the week. He sat down. He arranged his parchment and his book. He waited. Umbridge arrived in her usual way, the door opening just before the bell, the click of heels on stone, the pink robes settling into place behind the desk. She smiled at the class, generally. The class, as it had learned to do, smiled carefully back. Harry did not feel afraid. He had spent enough of the year cataloguing the specific texture of his fear in this room that he noticed its absence immediately. It wasn't that she was less dangerous. She had the blood quill. She had detention authority. She had the full backing of the ministry and the unshakable conviction that she was on the correct side of every line she drew. None of that had changed. What had changed was that there was now also something else in motion, something she did not know about, something that had been in the air since before she woke up, moving southward toward London. She thought she was Harry's problem. She had been his problem for 5 weeks. She wasn't anymore. He opened his book to the correct page and read about the counterjinx for a minor, stunning variant and waited for the period to end. Between defense and transfiguration, in the corridor as the 5th years rearranged into a current moving toward the west wing, Ron came up beside him. "You all right?" Ron said. "Yeah," Harry said. They turned a corner. A beat of walking. Ron said, "No, I mean, did something happen?" Harry glanced at him. Ron was watching him with the particular attention he reserved for things he'd already decided he wasn't going to ask about twice. His ears had gone slightly pink at the tips, which they did when he was being careful rather than annoyed. Harry said, "I sent a letter." Ron nodded once, slowly, in the way he had of filing something rather than responding to it. He didn't ask who to. He didn't ask what about. They reached Transfiguration and joined the queue outside the locked door and stood there in easy quiet while someone went to find the professor. Ron's shoulder was warm against Harry's. That was all it was, and it was the right amount. After lessons, when the common room had filled with 5th years performing their evening argument about homework, Harry took the window seat at the far end of the tower and sat with his charms book open on his knee and didn't read it. Somewhere south of here, a tawny owl was carrying his name and the ministry's address on its leg. Somewhere in this castle, delivered already, or finding its way through internal passages, or sitting in a niche waiting for a hand to collect it, there was a letter addressed to the headmaster. Harry could not speed either of them up. He could not call them back. He had no idea what was going to happen, and no way to know until it did. He had spent 5 weeks waiting for someone with authority to look at his hand and act on what they saw. He had stopped waiting. He had done something instead. Whatever came next was going to come from a direction he didn't control, and he was going to have to stay where he was and let it reach him. The charms book was open to a page on summoning charms. He looked at the words for a while. This was the last moment of waiting. He didn't know that yet, but it was. The internal post arrived on her desk at 7:30. She almost sorted the sealed envelope into a stack for later. It was addressed in a student's handwriting, careful and deliberate, marked for the headmaster of Hogwarts along the outer fold. She turned it over. A secondary instruction ran across the back seal. To be opened in the event of absence. Otherwise, please deliver unopened. The castle's internal routing had sent it to her desk first, the standard path when the headmaster had standing instructions to hold correspondence for review. She had not known about those instructions. She opened the letter. She read it once, quickly. Then she sat still. Then she read it again. The blood quill section was on the second page after the formal withdrawal statement. She read the description of the instrument, the black quill, the user's own blood, letters carved directly into skin, with the specific, flattened attention of a woman who had learned, across 4 decades in this school, to understand a document before she permitted herself to feel it. She reached the sentence about the inscription, "I must not tell lies," cut into the back of his right hand. Permanent. 9 sessions across 5 weeks. Her hand tightened on the parchment. The guardianship section was on the 3rd page. The will, the named guardian, the imprisonment without a trial. The words, Chief Warlock, appeared, and she held very still for a moment, and kept reading. The final section. A pattern of concealment. A student kept over years, in ignorance of decisions that shaped his own life. She had been a teacher at Hogwarts for 39 years. She had administered hundreds of detentions, written references, collected injured students from Quidditch pitches, and in 1981 accepted without question the headmaster's word that the boy had been placed safely. She had not asked where. She had not asked with whom. She had trusted the judgment of a man she had trusted for 39 years, and she had spent 14 years watching that boy sit in her Transfiguration classroom and present her with his left hand when she asked students to extend their wand arm. The left hand, not the right. She had noticed. She had said nothing. She had told herself she could locate the specific shape of the reasoning now, that there were explanations for a student who favored a hand he perhaps found less comfortable, that it was not her place to interrogate a child's physical habits without cause. She sat with her hands flat on her desk and felt, very precisely, what it was to have given herself a reason when the reason she had given herself was insufficient. She stood up, took the letter, and went to find the headmaster. He was seated at his desk when she knocked and entered, and he looked up from his correspondence before she had reached the center of the room. Some other mechanism had reached him first. He had known something was coming before she arrived, and the way he looked at her over his half-moon spectacles confirmed it. The look of a man who had been expecting a specific thing and had now received confirmation. She put the letter on the desk in front of him. He read it. He read the full length of it without hurrying, his long fingers resting at the edge of the parchment, his face moving through nothing she could name. She had observed this composure for 39 years. She had admired it at various points for the precision it represented. She did not admire it now. He finished. He set the pages on the desk and did not move for a long time. "I will need to speak with him," she said. He was 114 years old. She did not, ordinarily, think about his age in the same room with him. What she thought about now was the arithmetic happening behind his face. He was not calculating what he should have done. He had, she suspected, finished that calculation and moved on. He was calculating what to do now. "Yes," he said. "You will." She took the letter back because he did not reach for it, and left. The owl arrived at the Department of Magical Law Enforcement at 9:47 in the morning, bearing a double-sealed envelope marked urgent. Amelia Bones reached it at 10:10, between a request for additional aura assignment to the Northumberland boundary and a patrol report. She opened the envelope and read the first paragraph and sat forward. 22 years in this office had given her the specific ability to identify, within the opening lines of any complaint or report, what kind of document she was reading. Allegations without evidence. Genuine harm buried in language designed to be easy to ignore. Things constructed to produce an outcome rather than a response. This was none of those. This was a named 15-year-old registered student withdrawing from a ministry-registered school and providing a physical description of injuries that could be examined and verified, a specific instrument, a specific duration, a specific visible result on a specific part of his body. He had stated plainly that he intended to present his hand as evidence. This was not a complaint. It was a documentation. She read the rest without stopping. The guardianship section. The will, the named guardian, the imprisonment without trial. She noted the claim about the chief warlock and the year and the absence of any convened hearing. She set the letter down for a moment when she reached that part, not because she doubted it, but because she needed a moment before she kept reading. She had been at Harry's hearing in August. She had watched Dumbledore manage that proceeding with the complete fluency of a man navigating an institution he had helped build, and she had thought at the time that the boy was lucky he came. She thought about that now with a different quality of attention. The final section, the pattern of withholding, she read twice. "I need someone at Hogwarts within the hour," she said, when her junior aura appeared in the doorway. "Send a healer. Formal examination, documented record. Ministry code, safeguarding. This morning." The aura left. Bones sat with the letter in front of her for another moment, looking at the careful, deliberate handwriting of someone who had spent considerable time deciding how to write this before he picked up the quill. She reached for a notepad and began to write. Cornelius Fudge learned about the letter at 11 o'clock. A student had withdrawn from Hogwarts, his secretary explained, and sent a copy to the DMLE, citing grievances. The DMLE was already responding. It was Potter. Harry Potter. His first thought, he acknowledged it, was that this was useful. A student voluntarily leaving Hogwarts weakened Dumbledore considerably. He had been arguing for ministry oversight of the school for 2 months without making significant progress. He asked to see the letter. He read to the end of the first page. He turned it over. He read the description of the instrument, the black quill, writing in blood, the carving of letters directly into skin, and the expression on his face changed in a way he was aware of and could not prevent. He was not unintelligent. He knew what certain instruments were and what category they occupied, and what the official position was on their use as corrective tools in educational settings. That position was not the one that had apparently been applied. He set the letter down. He sent for Dolores. She arrived at 11:15, looking exactly as she always did. Composed, precise, the small smile in place. He had found it useful, that smile, and had approved her appointment to the school, partly because of it. It looked different in his office now, with the letter open on the desk between them. He put the relevant pages in front of her. She read. She did not show fear. She was not, he had long understood, constitutionally capable of it. What she showed was a gathered stillness. And then she said, in the same pleasant voice she used for everything, that the instrument described had been sanctioned for use in educational correction settings. She said it without hesitation. She said it the way she said everything, as though the act of stating a thing in that tone constituted its own sufficient evidence. Fudge looked at her across his desk. Somewhere through the wall, a junior aura was making the flu connection to Hogwarts. He had spent 2 months trying to set institutional machinery in motion against Dumbledore. He had not expected a 15-year-old boy to do it for him. The machinery was running now, and it would run on its own, and whatever he said in this room in the next few minutes, the letter had already arrived, and the healer was already going. He kept looking at Dolores Umbridge and said nothing at all. He was pulled from herbology at 10:30 by a 5th-year prefect he didn't know well, carrying a note from the deputy headmistress, Harry Potter to report to the hospital wing immediately. No explanation. The class had gone quiet when his name was called. He had collected his bag and followed the prefect out without looking at Ron or Hermione, and the door had closed behind him, and he had walked through the castle's late morning quiet, knowing, not guessing, but knowing, that the letters had arrived. The hospital wing smelled the way it always did, clean linen and something herbal, and the particular antiseptic quality of a room where things were put right. Madame Pomfrey was waiting for him at the far end of the ward, near a set of screened beds. A man in ministry robes sat at a small table beside the window, with parchment and an official seal. He had the careful, professionally neutral expression of a functionary who had been sent to witness something and had instructions to keep his reactions to himself. "Mr. Potter," Pomfrey said, "sit down, please." He sat. She was brisk about it, the way she was brisk about everything medical, precise, efficient, no visible warmth in the procedure itself. She asked him to extend his right hand, palm down. She produced a small glass instrument, turned it over his hand once, and then set it down on the tray beside her, and looked at what was there. The words were faint in the morning light. He'd had to angle his hand toward windows for weeks to see them properly. But in the hospital wing's brightness, they showed clearly, the silvered indentations of letters that had never healed and would not. She examined the inscription without touching it for a long moment. Then she began documenting. The ministry official noted the time. Pomfrey dictated, in a flat and measured voice that Harry had never heard her use before, the length and depth of the scarring, the distribution of each letter across the dorsal surface of his right hand, the absence of any sign of healing or attempted healing, the instrument type consistent with, and here she paused, one precise beat, a blood quill, a prohibited instrument, categorized under the ministry's own restricted dark objects framework, with no sanctioned use in any educational setting. She continued. Harry sat very still. He kept his breathing even. The ministry official's quill moved steadily across the parchment. Pomfrey finished her dictation and set down her own quill and looked at his hand one more time, and the careful, professional flatness left her face for a moment. Just a moment. The controlled fury of a woman who had been working in this room for a very long time and had an extremely precise understanding of what children's bodies were and were not for. And then she had it back again. She signed the documentation. She pressed the ministry seal. She looked at him directly. "This will not be kept quiet, Mr. Potter," she said. It was not a question. Harry looked at her. He had not told anyone for 5 weeks. He had sat in this very wing at the start of term with a different kind of injury, and kept the right hand still under the blanket, and said nothing when she asked if there was anything else he needed her to look at. He thought about that now. "No," he said, "it won't." The medical report arrived at the Department of Magical Law Enforcement at 11:15 via Ministry Flu from the Hogwarts wing. Amelia Bones read it in 4 minutes. It confirmed what Harry's letter had described: a blood quill, multiple sessions, physical inscription permanent in the skin of a 15-year-old student. A prohibited instrument. The documentation was complete, witnessed, signed by the attending school matron under ministry authority, and legally admissible in Wizengamot proceedings. Bones made 2 copies. The first went to the active investigation file she had opened that morning. The second she sent by internal courier to the Wizengamot Administration Services, the sub-office responsible for managing the schedule, record and membership of the Wizengamot, with a cover note designating it urgent and flagging the relevant statute. She had drafted the note before the report arrived. She had known, from the moment she finished reading the withdrawal letter that morning, that this was the direction it would go. She had read the record of what had not happened in 1981, the gap, the anomaly that had been allowed to settle into fact. It had now been named in a document written by a 15-year-old boy, and the document was in the official record, and it was not going back out. The package arrived on Percy Weasley's desk at 11:47, routed to him for filing as a junior assistant to the minister, Harry's withdrawal letter, the medical report, and a summary sheet from the Wizengamot Administration Services indicating that the materials had been designated for emergency session reference and required stamping before being transferred to the session record. Standard administrative procedure. He reached for his stamp. He read the cover sheet first, as he always did. Then he opened the withdrawal letter to check the identifying details: student name, school year, filing date. And he read Harry's name, and his eye continued down the page, and he did not stop reading. He read the blood quill section. He was 19 years old. He had been in this office for 3 months, and had spent them learning the shape of the ministry, how it processed things into categories, and categories into procedures. He believed in that. He had believed in it before he started here, and had written Ron a letter over the summer telling him to believe in it as well. He had meant every word when he wrote it. He read the part about the will and the named guardian. He read the claim about the chief warlock and the absence of a trial. He read these things in sequence, in Harry's careful handwriting, and he thought about Ron, who was in his 5th year at Hogwarts right now, and about the look his father had given him the last time they had been in the same room, which Percy had been able to hold because he was 19 years old, and he had made a choice. He stamped the materials. He completed the transfer routing. He sent the package to the Wizengamot Administration Services office by internal courier, which was the correct procedure, which was what he was supposed to do. He did not stop thinking about it. Tiberius Ogden had resigned from the Wizengamot in protest 3 weeks ago, when Dolores Umbridge was appointed to Hogwarts over the objections of more members than anyone had put into writing. He had submitted his letter of resignation to the Administration Services Office, formally, in the correct format, and he had gone home, and he had been waiting with the particular patience of a man who has made a point and is waiting to see whether anyone receives it. He received word through an unofficial channel, a brief note from someone inside the DMLE, who owed him, and who understood that he would want to know, that a formal medical report had been filed that morning, confirming blood quill use on a student at Hogwarts, the same appointment. He wrote a letter to the Wizengamot Administration Services requesting an emergency full session. He had been on the Wizengamot for 21 years. He knew the procedure. Griselda Marchbanks had also resigned over the appointment, and she co-signed his request before noon. She had been on the Wizengamot considerably longer than Ogden, and she signed in the firm, undecorated hand of someone who did not require flourish to make a point. The point was in the document itself. 3 weeks ago, they had resigned over the appointment of the woman now confirmed to have used a prohibited instrument on a student's hand. That was what needed to be on the record. The Wizengamot Administration Services issued its emergency session notification at 11:53 in the morning. Courtroom 10, Level 10, Ministry of Magic. Full membership summoned. Grounds: emergency review of matter pertaining to student welfare and ministry oversight of educational institutions with attendant questions of legal record regarding the events of 1981. Cornelius Fudge received his notification as Minister for Magic and was informed that, as the session had been convened on the request of 2 former Wizengamot members citing institutional dereliction, his attendance was required but not sufficient to prevent the session. The session was already convened. His attendance was simply expected. Amelia Bones received her notification in her office, where she had been waiting for it. At Hogwarts, an owl arrived in the headmaster's office bearing a ministry seal and a summons to appear before the full Wizengamot at noon. The owl waited on its perch. In the hospital wing, Harry Potter was being escorted back to his classes, his right hand at his side, the sealed report already gone from the building and not coming back. Courtroom 10 was not a room that suggested mercy. Level 10, Ministry of Magic. Below the marble atrium and the golden fountain, below the offices and the corridors and the ordinary machinery of government. Below everything, the stone walls, the bracket torches, the high horseshoe of tiered benches rising around a floor where people had stood and been told what they were now. Harry Potter had stood on that floor in August. The chair at the centre had not been for him, but he had seen it, and the chamber had imprinted on him in the specific way that places imprint when you are afraid inside them. This morning there was no accused. The Wizengamot had convened in emergency session to act on what was already in the record. 51 members filed in and took their seats. The plum robes moved through the torchlight and settled. The silver W embroidered on each breast caught and held. Cornelius Fudge took his place at the center of the highest tier, with the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement to his left in the same configuration they had occupied on the 12th of August, when the boy had stood below and been acquitted. Most of the members settling into their seats had been in this room that day. Several of them were now about to vote on what had been done to him since. Dolores Umbridge was shown to an observer's position on the far right of the lower tier. She settled into her chair with the composed and particular stillness of someone who has calculated precisely that stillness is the most useful thing she can currently offer. Amelia Bones rose from her seat and addressed the chamber. She had 22 years in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement and had spent them learning exactly how rooms like this one moved. She presented the 3 counts in the same tone she would have used to read a weather report. Clear, precise, without theatrical weight, because the weight was in the facts, and the facts did not require assistance. Count 1. That Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, serving as Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot in the autumn of 1981, had failed in his duty to ensure that Sirius Orion Black was brought before this body for a hearing in accordance with wizarding legal procedure. Sirius Black had been imprisoned in Azkaban on or around the 1st of November 1981. He had not been convicted of any crime by this court. No proceeding of any kind had been convened before his imprisonment. He had remained in Azkaban for 12 years. At the time of his imprisonment, the Chief Warlock had held the authority to compel a hearing within 48 hours. He had not exercised it. Count 2. That Albus Dumbledore, acting without court authorization on the 1st of November 1981, had placed Harry James Potter, orphaned on that date, with Petunia and Vernon Dursley, contrary to the terms of a legal will prepared by James and Lily Potter prior to their deaths, which had named Sirius Black as the child's guardian. The will had not been followed. No court had authorized the deviation. The placement had stood for 14 years. Count 3. That Albus Dumbledore, serving as headmaster of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, had failed to prevent or investigate the repeated use of a blood quill, a catalogued prohibited instrument under the Ministry's Dark Objects framework, on an underage student in his school's care. The student was 15 years old. The sessions had occurred across a minimum of 9 documented occasions in September and October of 1995. A medical examination had been conducted that morning under ministry authority. The scarring on the student's right hand was permanent. The report was before the court. The chamber was very quiet. The chair at floor level, placed to one side as a matter of formal expectation, held no one. It was the chair the headmaster of Hogwarts would have sat in, as witness and respondent, had he come. The summons had been sent. The owl had been dispatched. Dumbledore had not arrived. Fudge noted the absence formally at the session's opening. It was within the Wizengamot's authority to proceed without a respondent present, provided the respondent had been duly notified. The respondent had been duly notified. The chamber had observed this, and looked briefly at the empty chair, and then looked away from it. There was nothing instructive in an empty chair. The decision behind it, whether defiance or calculation or something in between, was invisible. The chamber did not wait to learn which. The debate on Count 1 was the longest. 3 members of the long-serving cohort, men who had sat in this chamber since before the war, made the argument that the autumn of 1981 had been exceptional. The war had ended suddenly. The ordinary mechanisms of governance had been overwhelmed. The decisions made in those weeks about what to do with suspects and prisoners reflected extraordinary pressure applied to ordinary institutions. They did not argue that the imprisonment had been right. They argued that the circumstances complicated the question of individual accountability. Bones did not dispute the circumstances. She said, the statute governing Wizengamot procedure was not suspended in 1981. She said, the mechanism for extraordinary circumstances was an emergency session, which this body had convened in under 48 hours on previous occasions, and could have convened for Sirius Black. She said, the record showed no request for such a session, no memo, no procedural correspondence of any kind from the office of the Chief Warlock regarding the prisoner Sirius Black. She said all of this in the same clear and level register she had used for the 3 counts. She was not making an argument exactly. She was reading a record. A younger voice from the middle tier said, Counts 1 and 2 concern 1981. The matter before this court for which evidence exists, examined this morning, is Count 3. Several heads turned toward the observer's seat on the far right. Dolores Umbridge did not shift. The vote was called at 11:48 in the morning. On Count 3, formal censure of the headmaster of Hogwarts for failure to prevent the use of a prohibited dark instrument on a minor in his care across multiple documented sessions. The motion passed. The secretary called the count aloud, 43 in favor, 4 abstentions, 4 against. She noted the time. On Counts 1 and 2, formal mandated inquiry into the 1981 imprisonment and the guardianship placement. The motion for inquiry passed, 37 in favor, 7 abstentions, 7 against. It was 11:51 in the morning. The torches had not changed. The plum robes had not changed. The chamber was exactly what it had always been, a room at the bottom of the Ministry of Magic, where the Wizengamot met to make determinations. 4 members had voted against. Their votes were in the record in the company of everyone else's. Every member present had registered a position. Not every position was the same. Every seat had turned. The session secretary sealed the record. The chamber emptied. Plum robes filed toward the exits. Side conversations began before members had fully cleared the tiers, the institutional version of a collective exhale. Dolores Umbridge was formally requested to remain and submit a statement to the DMLE before leaving. She rose from her observer's seat with no visible change of expression and accompanied the attending aura with the composure of someone who has decided that the most useful thing, right up until the moment it stops being useful, is composure. Fudge stood at the front of the emptied chamber for a moment. He had presided. The proceeding had gone as proceedings went. The evidence had been presented. The debate had been had. The vote had been taken. He had presided over all of it in the correct order. He did not feel triumphant. He had spent the summer positioning himself against Dumbledore's influence. and he had spent the morning watching the machinery of an institution move in a direction he had wanted but had not actually set in motion. A 15-year-old boy had set it in motion. The letter had arrived, and the evidence had been examined, and the vote had been taken, and Fudge had sat at the top of the tier and called the counts and marked the results, and all of it had the slightly vertiginous quality of running alongside something very large that had decided, entirely on its own, where it was going. He straightened his robes and walked out. In the corridor above, a junior assistant to the minister was collecting the sealed vote tally sheets from the session secretary for transfer to the permanent Wizengamot record. He had been in the building for the full duration of the session. He had not been inside the chamber. He had seen the tally sheets come out. He filed them in the correct order and the correct cabinet and returned to his desk without saying anything to anyone. And the tallies went into the record, and the record closed. The visitor entrance on the London street above, the anonymous door, the phone box, the slow descent through the city's underside, was not a route Albus Dumbledore used often. He was 114 years old, and had long since found more expedient ways to arrive at the Ministry of Magic. He used the phone box today, because the Ministry's aura on duty had been sent specifically to escort him, and arriving at the visitor entrance was the procedure the escort required, and Albus Dumbledore had, by the time he stepped out into the atrium's golden light, already made his decision. He had made it on the walk from Hogwarts. The Wizengamot had voted. Every act he had taken since 1981 was on the record without context, and the institutional machinery was running without him, and if he did not provide the framework within which his decisions became comprehensible, the inquiry would arrive at its own conclusion. The framework was the prophecy. He had never intended to give it to them. He was going to give it to them now. He was escorted past the Golden Fountain and into a lift, and down to a committee room on level 2 that had been reserved for his deposition. Amelia Bones was at the head of the table. 2 other committee members sat to her right. A court recorder occupied the far end. The room had the functional quality of a place designed for work rather than ceremony, which Dumbledore found, at this particular moment, appropriate. He sat down. He was without warmth. He had decided that warmth here would not help him. Bones noted his voluntary attendance for the record and asked whether he was prepared to address the 3 counts. He said he would prefer to begin with a statement of context, without which the 3 counts could not be accurately understood. She looked at him. She said, "Proceed." He told them about the prophecy. He gave them the full text, as Sybil Trelawney had spoken it in the spring of 1980. The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches, born to those who have thrice defied him, born as the 7th month dies. The Dark Lord will mark him as his equal, but he will have power the Dark Lord knows not, and either must die at the hand of the other, for neither can live while the other survives. Harry Potter was born at the end of July 1980. Voldemort had marked him on the night of the 31st of October 1981. There had never been any doubt about which child the prophecy described. He told them what it had meant, in practice, for every decision that followed. The blood protection. Lily Potter's death, chosen freely and in explicit defense of her son, had activated ancient protective magic. As long as Harry could call the home of his blood relative his own, he was protected against those who served or followed Voldemort. The protection required blood. The relevant blood was Petunia Dursley. This was why Privet Drive. This was why the Dursleys, specifically, rather than a wizarding family, regardless of what a will had named, and why the arrangement had held for 14 years. The ancient magic had required blood. The will had named a person. The 2 were not compatible, and he had determined that the magic took precedence. He told them about Year 5. Since Voldemort's return in June of the previous year, Dumbledore had known that the connection between Voldemort and Harry, created at the moment of Voldemort's first failed attack, was being actively exploited. Voldemort could access Harry's emotional states and, under sufficient conditions, perceive through his senses. The closer Harry was to information about the threat they faced, the more that information was accessible to Voldemort. The silence in Year 5, the withholding of information about the Order, about the nature of the threat, about Harry's situation, had been designed to protect Harry by keeping the conduit empty. He had finished. The room was quiet. Amelia Bones set down her quill. She asked. This prophecy had been in his possession since 1980. In 15 years, he had made no report of its existence to the Wizengamot. He acknowledged this. He said the fewer people who knew of the prophecy, the fewer ways it could reach Voldemort. She asked. He had held a prophecy establishing the conditions of Harry Potter's survival, made unilateral decisions based on it about where Harry would live, under what conditions, with whom, and had shared this information with no independent authority in 15 years. He acknowledged this also. A second committee member asked about the blood protection. He had placed a child with a family, and she consulted the placement correspondence of November 1981 for the precise language, under conditions he himself had described as not suited to a child with Harry's particular background. He had maintained that placement for 14 years, on the basis of a magical principle that no independent magical authority had reviewed, validated, or even been informed of. He said, the blood protection was not a theory to be validated. It had held. The committee member said, it had held at a cost that the child subject to it hadn't been able to report to anyone with the power to act, because the people with the power to act hadn't been told the relevant facts by the one person who held them. No one added to this. The court recorder's quill had stopped moving. Bones was looking at him with the expression she had used at Harry's hearing in August. The monocle held still, the square jaw set, but with a quality that was different now, something that had moved past procedural and into something colder. Dumbledore understood what had happened. The prophecy had been intended to explain the 3 counts. It had instead produced an unstated 4th. He had managed Harry Potter's life for 15 years as a strategic consideration, making decisions about the child's housing and safety and knowledge on the basis of information he had designated as his alone to hold. The defense had confirmed what the charges implied. The prophecy made everything legible. It simply made it legible in the wrong direction. The deposition concluded. He was escorted to the phone box and up to the October Street, and he walked away from the ministry in the grey London afternoon, and did not permit himself to calculate yet what came next. The message reached Hogwarts through order channels in the early evening, a summary that moved faster than the ministry's official post, and that people in Severus Snape's position had learned to read in a single pass. He read it once, in his office below the dungeon stairs, and set it down on the corner of his desk. He had known about the prophecy for 15 years. He had carried it to Voldemort. He had gone back to Dumbledore when he understood what it meant, and had spent the years since operating as Dumbledore's instrument inside Voldemort's service, concealing everything he knew, for every year of the 15 that followed. Silence had been the only condition under which the work remained possible. He understood silence as a professional and personal practice in a way that most people who deployed it as a strategy did not. Dumbledore had told the prophecy to the committee as a defense. Snape understood the logic. He also understood, with the particular clarity of someone who had been on the receiving end of that logic, why it would not work. The defense said, I withheld this because I judged it was mine to withhold. I made these decisions because I knew what was necessary and you did not. and I chose not to tell you so that you could not decide differently." Snape had been told when he first came to Dumbledore, "Say nothing. Trust that I know what this requires." He had trusted. He knew what that trust looked like from the inside. He knew the weight of the thing you carried without telling anyone, and the way it grew heavier in specific rooms and never became lighter, only familiar. The Wizengamot was not going to receive this the way Snape had received it, because they had not made the choice Snape had made, and they did not owe the debt Snape owed. They were going to receive it as it read on paper, as a man who had decided a child's life was his to arrange, and had arranged it, and had called this protection. Snape folded the message and set it back on the corner of his desk. He looked at the stone wall in front of him for a moment. Then he picked up his quill and returned to the third-year essays on Bulbadox powder, and the evening continued. The formal record of the deposition was filed with the Wizengamot Administration Services that night. Its effect was additive. His Wizengamot and ICW titles had already been stripped in September. The deposition added the confirmed formal censure. He remained headmaster of Hogwarts. That appointment lay with the Board of Governors and was not within the Wizengamot's reach. Outside the school's walls, his institutional authority was now fully gone, and the record said so explicitly. The probate archives at the Ministry of Magic occupied a sub-corridor off Level 5, behind a door that required a signature from the Department of Magical Law Enforcement to open. Amelia Bones's office sent the request at 9 in the morning and had the document by past. It had been there for 14 years, filed correctly, bearing the proper seals. The last will and testament of James Charles Potter, dated October of 1981, executed with 2 witnesses and the correct magical binding. The document was 1 page. It named Harry James Potter as heir to the Potter estate. It named, clearly and without conditional language, Sirius Orion Black as Harry's guardian in the event of James's death. The archivist noted in the standard transfer form that no inquiry had previously been made regarding the document's provisions as they pertained to the child's placement. The document had been filed. The provisions had not been followed. No record existed of any legal instrument authorizing the deviation. Bones had the document on her desk by 10 o'clock. She read it once, then had it copied, then sent it to the inquiry file with a notation. Express testamentary instruction, dated and witnessed, not followed. She did not add an opinion. The document was its own opinion. The arrest record for Sirius Orion Black arrived from the Ministry's Internal Records Office at 10:45. It was brief. It recorded an arrest on the 3rd of November 1981, 2 days after the deaths of James and Lily Potter. It recorded transfer to Azkaban prison. It recorded the name of the arresting officer. It did not record a charge. It did not record a hearing date. It did not record a Wizengamot session number, because there had been no session. The Wizengamot's own records, cross-referenced by the inquiry's administrative clerk, confirmed this. No session had ever been convened to try Sirius Black. He had been arrested and transferred to Azkaban. He had remained there for 12 years. Bones reviewed the 2 documents side by side. The will, naming him guardian. The arrest record, recording his imprisonment 2 days after the deaths of the people whose will named him. The Wizengamot records, showing no trial. She added a notation to the inquiry file. Matter referred for emergency evidentiary hearing. Not acquittal. A hearing. The distinction mattered, and she set it down in the file with the precision of someone who had learned, early in her career, that the difference between what a document said and what a document meant was exactly where most things went wrong. The message arrived at 12 Grimmauld Place in the early afternoon through order channels. A sealed packet delivered by a ministry-connected owl that landed on the kitchen table with the particular heaviness of something that had been travelling urgently. Bill Weasley was the only one in the kitchen at that hour. He was 25 years old, 3 years out of Hogwarts, a curse-breaker for Gringotts, currently on leave to assist with order work. And he had the specific practical advantage of not having a 14-year history with the situation that made it difficult to read the information plainly. He opened the packet. He read it. He was still holding it when Sirius came in from the hallway. Thin, grey-eyed, moving with the particular restlessness of a man who lived in a house he did not choose for reasons that had not yet been resolved. He had been more himself in the months since returning here than Bill had been told to expect, but there was still something about the way he carried his shoulders, something about the quality of his attention to rooms and exits that had not come back from wherever Azkaban had taken it. He stopped when he saw Bill's expression. "What?" Sirius said. Not a question. Bill put the packet on the table. He said, "The Wizengamot had convened in emergency session that morning. Formal censure had passed. Count 3, the blood quill. Inquiry had been mandated on counts 1 and 2. He said, count 2 was the will. He said, the will was in the formal inquiry record now." Sirius looked at him. Bill said, "They retrieved it from the probate archive this morning. It was entered into evidence. For the first time since 1981, a Wizengamot process had the document in its official file, in the context of a legal inquiry." He waited to see what Sirius would do with this. Sirius sat down at the kitchen table. He did not do it the way a person sat down when they had received good news. He did it the way a person sat down when something they have been carrying for a long time has been acknowledged, and the acknowledgement is correct, and it changes nothing about how long it has been, and something about being right for 14 years when you could not prove it in any room that had the power to care turns out to feel less like relief than it looks from the outside. He had known what was in the will. James had told him. He had been sitting in this house, in this kitchen, for months now, knowing that somewhere in a ministry archive a document existed that said exactly what he had been told it said, and knowing that Dumbledore knew it was there, and knowing that no one with institutional authority had been asked to look at it. No one had asked him, either. He had not been in a position to ask. He was a man living under a Fidelius charm, in a house he'd inherited from a family he hadn't spoken to in 20 years, technically a fugitive, and his asking was not the kind of asking that produced results in Wizengamot proceedings. He had known it would take someone else. He had not known it would take this. "Where is Harry now?" he said. Not a question either. Quite, more the shape of one, placed on the table between them. "At Hogwarts," Bill said. "Still." Sirius nodded once. He put his hands flat on the table in front of him and looked at them for a moment, and said nothing else. The kitchen was quiet. Somewhere above them, the house made its usual sounds. The groan of old timber, the intermittent rattle of something in the walls that they had not yet identified and probably didn't want to. 12 Grimmauld Place was not a house that offered comfort, and it did not offer any now. It was simply the room where Sirius Black had learned that a 15-year-old boy had done in a single morning what Sirius had spent 14 years being unable to do, and that it had worked, and that Harry was still at Hogwarts. Bill set the packet on the table between them, and didn't say anything either. There wasn't much to say. The document was in the file. The inquiry had been mandated. These things were true now in a way they had not been true this morning. After a while, Sirius stood up and left the kitchen. Bill heard him on the stairs, and then the sound of a door, and then nothing. The inquiry did not acquit Sirius Black. It could not. Acquittal required a full evidentiary hearing with the original evidence, which had not yet been convened. The Fidelius charm still held the house. He could not appear publicly. He could not go to Harry. He could not walk down a London street. He was still, legally, exactly what he had been yesterday morning. A man who had escaped Azkaban and had not been recaptured, which was not the same thing as a man who had been found innocent. But the file that said no trial had ever been held was in the Wizengamot's formal record now. The inquiry had been referred for an emergency evidentiary hearing. A process existed that had not existed this morning, and at the start of that process was a document from a ministry probate archive that said Sirius Orion Black was supposed to have been Harry Potter's guardian for 14 years. That was what the morning had produced. Not freedom. A record. A process. The beginning of the thing, which was not the thing itself, but was the first fact in a chain of facts that had not previously existed in any official file anywhere. It was something. Bill stayed in the kitchen for a while longer, with the empty table in front of him, and let it be something. The Daily Prophet had run the story on the front page, and every owl in the Hogwarts Post had been carrying copies of it when the morning flock arrived. And so by the time Harry came down to breakfast, he had already missed the moment when the school found out, and was instead walking into the aftermath. The corridors felt different. He could not immediately name how, only that they did, a quality of attention directed at him that was not the pointed whispering of the year's first weeks, when people had been calling him a liar, and the prophet had been printing things about his mental state. That had been a specific kind of different. The cold shouldering, the edging away, the particular performance of not looking. This was not that. People were looking. A second year he didn't know stepped sideways to let him pass, and then didn't appear to know what to do next, and stood there with her books pressed against her chest as though she'd made a decision she hadn't thought through. A small cluster of Hufflepuffs in the entrance hall went quiet when he went past. Harry did not feel victorious. He felt as though he had thrown a stone at a window, and the stone had gone through the window, and also through the wall behind it, and possibly the next building over. And he was only now beginning to understand the scale of the throw. The prophet had named the blood quill. It had named the Wizengamot session, the censure vote, the inquiry into Sirius Black's untried imprisonment, and the prophecy that Dumbledore had revealed in his deposition. It had named Harry by full name and printed the year and his age, and the phrase formal withdrawal from Hogwarts in the headline, and below that, in smaller text, sources indicate ministry received documentation of blood quill injuries. He ate his breakfast without tasting it and went to class. Fred and George found him between charms and transfiguration in the corridor near the second-floor staircase, appearing from opposite directions in a way that suggested coordination. "Harry Potter," Fred said, with the tone of a person making a formal announcement. "You absolute legend." "I haven't done anything," Harry said, which was not true, and he knew it was not true, but he also didn't know what else to say. "That's a very gracious position," George said. "Completely inaccurate, but gracious." "They're saying you've brought down Dumbledore," Fred said. He was watching Harry with the particular bright attention the twins directed at things they found genuinely interesting, which was slightly different from the performance of interest they aimed at people they were winding up. This was the real version. "I haven't brought down Dumbledore," Harry said. "I wrote a letter. I wasn't even trying to. It wasn't about Dumbledore, specifically. It was about—" He stopped. "The hand," George said, without the lightness, and Harry looked at him and nodded. There was a brief pause. Fred said, How did you know a withdrawal letter was the right thing? I didn't know. I just couldn't keep quiet anymore. Harry looked at the floor for a moment, then back up. I'd been keeping quiet for 5 weeks. I just stopped. Fred and George looked at each other. It was the specific look they exchanged when something was funnier than it was possible to express at the current volume, except it wasn't quite that. It was the look they exchanged when they had encountered something they genuinely respected and weren't entirely sure what to do with it. Right, George said. Okay, Fred agreed. That is, George said, without question, the most Gryffindor thing, Fred finished, we have ever personally witnessed. Harry shook his head and kept walking to Transfiguration. They fell into step on either side of him, which he found, despite everything, unexpectedly reassuring. Hermione came to him after dinner, in the common room, with a substantial quantity of parchment rolled under her arm. She found him in the chair nearest the window and sat down across from him, and unrolled the first sheet before she said anything. Wizarding guardianship law, she said, is significantly clearer on testamentary precedents than Muggle inheritance law. A magical will executed with 2 witnesses and a binding spell carries equal status to a court determination. Dumbledore's placement of you with your aunt, without going through the Wizengamot, was technically a unilateral override of a legally binding testamentary instrument. She looked up. Which is, by the way, not legal. I didn't know that, Harry said. I know you didn't. That's what I'm... Harry, you didn't know about the will. You didn't know about the legal mechanism. You didn't know the prophecy existed, or that Dumbledore had used it as the framework for every decision about your life. She put the parchment down on her knee. You just wrote what was true. About your hand. About Sirius. About the pattern. You wrote what you could see. Yeah, Harry said. Hermione was quiet for a moment. She looked at her notes, and then at Harry, with an expression he'd seen occasionally over 5 years. The one she wore when something had exceeded her categories, and she was in the process of recalibrating. That might be the most legally effective thing anyone has done in this building in 4 years, she said. Possibly longer. Harry didn't know what to say to that. He looked at the fire. After a while, Hermione began explaining the procedural mechanics of the Sirius inquiry, and he listened, and it helped more than he expected to have someone explain the shape of the thing he had accidentally made. Neville found him later, when the common room had thinned out and most people had gone to bed. He sat down in the chair Hermione had vacated and said nothing for a moment. He was round-faced and still, and he had the quality he sometimes had in quiet moments of looking as though he was carrying something he was not going to put down. Did you know? He said. He stopped. Tried again. There's a prophecy. They're saying, the prophet says Dumbledore had a prophecy about you and Voldemort, and he never told you. No, Harry said. I didn't know. Neville nodded. He was looking at the fire. Harry looked at him, at the particular stillness of his profile, and understood, without needing it, said that Neville wasn't only thinking about Harry, he was thinking about what a prophecy described, a child born at the end of July 1980, to parents who had defied Voldemort 3 times. Neville had been born on the 30th of July 1980. His parents had been in the Order of the Phoenix. They had defied Voldemort 3 times. They were in the Janus Thicky ward at St. Mungo's, and they had been there since November of 1981. And Dumbledore had known about the prophecy since before either of them was born. Neville knew this. Harry knew he knew it. Neville said nothing about it, and Harry did not ask. They sat together for a few minutes without speaking. Then Neville got up and said good night and went upstairs, and the fire crackled and settled. Ginny appeared from somewhere near the girls' dormitory stairs, long after the common room had emptied. She looked at Harry with the specific directness she had. 4 years at Hogwarts and a year of being possessed by Voldemort had left her with very little capacity for indirectness, and came and sat on the arm of the chair across from him, rather than in it. "Everyone's gone to bed," she said, which was not a question. "Yeah." She looked at him for a moment. "What do you want now?" she said. "You started something. The Wizengamot voted, and Dumbledore had to testify. And there's an inquiry into Sirius. You set all of that going. What do you want to happen?" Harry thought about this for a long time. The fire had gone down to embers. Outside the window, the Hogwarts grounds were completely dark. "I want someone to have been wrong out loud," he said finally. "Not just quietly wrong, in a file somewhere. Wrong on the record, where it stays." Ginny considered this. She had brown eyes, and they were very steady when she used them to look at someone, which she was doing now. "That might be enough," she said. A pause. "Is it?" Harry didn't answer. He looked at the embers for a while. Ginny didn't push. She sat on the arm of the chair in the empty common room and let the silence be there, which was what he needed, which she apparently knew without his having to say it. He didn't know if it was enough. He knew it was what he had wanted, and that it had happened, and that those two facts were sitting next to each other, and that the space between them was something he was going to have to work out the size of on his own. 3 days after the session, Percy Weasley had organized the inquiry files into 7 cross-referenced folders, each with a color-coded tab and an index page at the front listing contents, page count, and the date of each document's entry into the official record. This was not what he had been asked to do. He had been asked to ensure the files were available for the inquiry committee. He had done that, and then he had organized them, because he was very good at organizing things, and because the files, when he had received them, were in a state that he could not look at without doing something about it. He was also, as a consequence of having organized them, the person in the minister's office who had read every document. He sat at his desk on the 3rd morning and looked at a specific series of memos from the month of August, before the start of term, before anyone had reported anything, between the minister's office and the Educational Decrees sub-office on Level 3. The memos concerned the implementation of Umbridge's appointment. They were administrative in nature, timetabling, staffing logistics, questions about the scope of her disciplinary authority. There was a memo, 3rd in the series, that authorized her to employ institutional correction instruments as approved within the ministry's standard educational framework. The phrase was bureaucratic and comfortable-looking, the kind of language designed to be skimmed rather than read. Percy had read it. He had then located the Educational Decrees sub-office's internal policy file, which contained an appendix dated 1992 listing approved institutional correction instruments. The blood quill was not named. The description of the relevant category: quill-based inscription instruments producing physical reinforcement of stated expectations, fitted precisely enough that the language had either been written with the blood quill in mind or constructed to encompass it without naming it. Percy sat with this information for a long time. He understood what it meant. If that memo and appendix entered the inquiry record, the chain of authorization ran from the blood quill detention back to the minister's office. Umbridge had told Fudge the instrument was sanctioned. She hadn't been wrong. Fudge hadn't personally authorized blood quill use on a student, but he had signed the memo authorizing the framework, appointed Umbridge with that authorization, and sent her to Hogwarts. The inquiry was currently focused on Dumbledore. Percy was 19 years old. He was a very good organizer. He was also the only person in the building who had read both the August memo and the 1992 appendix in the same week and understood their relationship. He did not go to his family. He had not spoken to his parents since the beginning of the academic year, when he had made the choice that had seemed, at the time, like the correct one. The ministry had asked him to use his position to provide information, and he had done so, and in doing so had told Ron, in a letter he still could not read without a specific quality of discomfort, to distance himself from Harry Potter. He had meant it when he wrote it. He had believed the ministry's position. He had written the letter with conviction and posted it, and not looked back. He looked back sometimes, now, not with conviction. He did not go to Harry. He did not write a confession. He sat at his desk and performed the arithmetic of institutional alignment. The ministry's position that Harry was unreliable, that Umbridge's oversight was legitimate, had not survived the inquiry. It was losing ground in a way positions did not recover from. Percy had put his name on documents that reflected that position. He was 19. This was the beginning of a career. He could not afford to be the person who had known things and filed them correctly and said nothing to anyone. Ogden and Marchbanks had submitted a formal document request 4 days ago as resigned but interested former Wizengamot members for the medical report and the inquiry summary. The request was routine. The processing period for routine document requests from former members was 15 working days. Percy processed it in 3. He had the dossier compiled, reviewed, sealed, and dispatched by Tuesday afternoon. It included the medical report from Poppy Pomfrey's examination of Harry's hand, with the attestation from the ministry witness, and the full inquiry summary, including the 3 counts and the censure vote. All of this had been requested. He had simply located and organized it efficiently, which was what he was employed to do. He had also included, clipped to the back of the inquiry summary, the August memo and the 1992 appendix. These had not been specifically requested. They were, arguably, relevant contextual documentation. They were also the documents that, in the right hands, completed the chain of authorization back to the minister's office. Ogden had been a Wizengamot member for longer than Percy had been alive. No one would know he had included them. The dossier had gone out under the standard dispatch seal. He knew. He sat at his desk and thought about what he had done and about the fact that it was, technically, within his remit, and about the fact that he had done it because he was recalculating and not because he had decided anything. The bottom drawer of his desk contained a letter he had written 5 weeks ago to his mother. He had meant to post it the following morning, then the morning after that, and had eventually stopped thinking of it as something he was going to post, and started thinking of it as something that existed in the bottom drawer. He knew what it said. He had written it on a Tuesday evening when he was tired, and had not yet organized the way his life was now arranged into something that felt inevitable. He opened the drawer. He looked at it. The envelope was sealed and addressed in his own handwriting. Mum. He had not written Molly or Mrs. Weasley because he had written Mum on letters to her for 19 years, and he had not been able to write anything else, even when he was trying to maintain appropriate professional distance from the family situation. He closed the drawer. This was not a decision. He was looking at a letter in a drawer and choosing not to post it today, as he had every day for 5 weeks. Not posting it was different from having decided not to. A decision would have required certainty he didn't have. He returned to the index on the 3rd inquiry folder and resumed the cross-referencing. At Hogwarts, in the Gryffindor common room, Ron Weasley received a letter from his mother on Thursday morning. It arrived with the rest of the post, carried by the family owl, and he recognized the handwriting on the envelope and set it aside until after breakfast, and then opened it in the corridor outside the Great Hall. His mother's letters were usually detailed, and involved lengthy updates on the garden and enquiries after his health and dietary habits. This letter was half a page. It said, "Your father says the ministry is in chaos, and he says Harry should know that this family is with him. I want you to tell him that. You tell him from me, Ronald." Ron read it twice. He folded it carefully along the original creases and put it in his inside pocket. He thought about what Harry would do when he said it. Harry would probably say something like, he was fine, or it wasn't a big deal, or he would look at the fire, or he would say thanks in the particular quiet way he said it when he meant something entirely different. Ron had known Harry for 5 years and had a fairly precise understanding of how Harry received information that made him feel something he didn't know what to do with. He found Harry between the 3rd and 4th period in the corridor outside Transfiguration and said, "My mum sent a letter. She says to tell you the family's with you." Harry looked at him. "She specifically said to tell you," Ron said. "From her. So." "Right," Harry said. He looked at the floor for a moment, then back up, and he said, "Yeah, okay." He said it very quietly. They went to Transfiguration. Ron didn't say anything else about it. Harry didn't either. He had taken to walking corridors in the evenings. He couldn't entirely explain why. Something about motion made the inside of his head quieter, or at least gave the things inside it enough room that they stopped pressing so hard against each other. He wasn't going anywhere specific. He was just walking through the stone passages of the castle in the 10 days after, when the Wizengamot inquiry was ongoing and the Daily Prophet was running a different story every morning, and the school was in the process of settling into a new relationship with what had happened, and Harry was in the process of trying to understand what he had made. The thing he kept returning to was not the vote or the censure or the inquiry into Sirius's imprisonment, though all of these were in his head constantly. What he kept returning to was the letter. He had written 4 pages at a desk by a window before dawn, with his right hand aching and his wand in his trunk, and 5 weeks of silence finally becoming intolerable, and the 4 pages had produced something of a scale he had not anticipated. He had known it was serious. He had not known it would be that serious. He walked the corridors and thought about that, and about what it meant to have been effective, which was different and stranger than he had expected. He heard Dumbledore's footsteps before he saw him. He knew the sound, the particular pace, unhurried and deliberate, that he'd heard in corridors since first year. He stopped walking. Dumbledore appeared at the far end of the corridor. He was tall and slightly stooped in his great age, his silver beard catching the torchlight, his half-moon spectacles low on his long, crooked nose. He was looking at Harry with an expression Harry had not seen on him before. Something careful and uncertain, the expression of a person who has rehearsed what he intends to say and is not certain, at the moment of beginning, that he has chosen correctly. He said, "Would you walk with me?" Harry considered this for a moment. "All right," he said. They walked. The corridors were empty at this hour. Their footsteps moved together through the torchlit stone, and neither of them said anything for a while. And then Dumbledore began. He had not told Harry about the prophecy, he said, for reasons that had seemed at the time sufficiently clear. Harry had been a child. The prophecy described a destiny that no child should carry any earlier than necessary. He had wanted to protect Harry from the weight of it for as long as possible, and this had been, he could see now, a decision he had made for Harry rather than with him. He said this plainly. He explained the prophecy's full text, the one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord, born to those who had thrice defied him, born as the 7th month died. The Dark Lord would mark him as his equal. Either must die at the hand of the other, for neither could live while the other survived. He had known since before Harry was born that this child existed, and that the child would be Harry. He had known it and had carried it alone. He explained the blood protection. Lily Potter's death, willingly chosen, had left an ancient magic embedded in Harry's blood, a protection that held as long as Harry could call the home of her blood relative his own. He had placed Harry with Petunia Dursley on the 1st of November, 1981, because the protection required it, and because the protection was the best chance Harry had of surviving the years until Voldemort's return. The will had named Sirius Black. He had not followed the will. He had placed Harry where the ancient magic required, and had not sought the Wizengamot's authorization, because doing so would have required disclosing the blood protection and the prophecy to people he could not guarantee would protect the information. He had made the calculation himself. He had made it alone. He explained the Year 5 silence. He had known since the end of the previous year that Voldemort was attempting to use the connection between himself and Harry as a conduit, to access Harry's emotional states, to perceive through his senses, to transmit images that could be mistaken for truth. This was why he had avoided Harry's eyes. This was why he had not spoken to him. The closer Harry was to Dumbledore, the more of Dumbledore's knowledge became accessible through that connection, and Voldemort had already been exploiting it. The occlumency lessons had been designed to teach Harry to close the connection from his end. They had not worked as well as he had hoped. He said, "I placed on you a task that was beyond your preparation for it, without explaining what was at stake." He said, "I am aware of this." He was thorough. He did not rush it. He spoke as though he was making a record, giving Harry everything he had denied him, in order, walking through the torchlit passages of the castle, and Harry listened to all of it. The blood protection, the prophecy, the silence, the occlumency. He listened, and when Dumbledore finished, they had reached the window at the far end of the 4th-floor corridor, which looked out over the dark grounds and the invisible lake, and Harry stood and looked at it for a moment. He said, "Did you know they were hurting me at Privet Drive?" The question hung in the corridor. Dumbledore was quiet. Not the quiet of a man composing an answer. The quiet of a man who has heard the specific question he knew was coming and is now deciding, in real time, what he is prepared to say. "I knew you were not being cared for as you deserved," Dumbledore said. Harry looked at him. "That's not an answer." "No," Dumbledore said. "It is not." The silence after that was the longest part. The torch nearest them crackled once. Below the window, the grounds were entirely dark. Dumbledore stood very still with his hands at his sides, and he did not say anything else, and he did not need to. He had known. Harry had known he had known. What the silence said was, he had known, and he had weighed it against the blood protection, and the blood protection had been his priority. And he was not going to say that this had been wrong, because in his framework, it hadn't been wrong. Harry had survived. The protection had held. And he was not going to say it had been right, because he was standing in a corridor with a 15-year-old boy whose right hand bore the words, "I must not tell lies," carved into the skin by an instrument that had been cutting into him for 5 weeks, while the people responsible for protecting him hadn't known it was happening because he had kept it quiet, as he had been keeping things quiet for most of his life. Dumbledore said, the blood protection was real. 14 years it held. The harm that came to you at Privet Drive occurred under a protection that also preserved your life. Harry said nothing. "I cannot reconcile those two facts into something comfortable," Dumbledore said. "The protection was real and the cost was not acceptable. I can say both. I cannot make them agree. A pause. And I cannot give you back what those years cost you. I am aware that I cannot. He said it without absolution in it. He was not asking Harry to forgive him. He was simply telling the truth, which was that both things were true, and they did not cancel each other out. Harry looked at the dark window for another moment. He said, "The protection also cost me everything real." He didn't look at Dumbledore again. He walked on down the corridor, past the torches, past the portraits whose painted occupants had gone unusually still, around the corner at the far end, and out of sight. Dumbledore stood in the empty corridor. The torch near the window moved in some draught he could not locate. His silver beard settled. His half-moon spectacles caught the light. He was 114 years old, and had, across that time, made a very large number of decisions that he had believed to be correct, and several that he had known were not. And he stood in the empty corridor with the full understanding that Harry Potter had not asked why he had done it, had not demanded an apology, had not wanted anything from him except the truth about one specific thing. He had given the truth about that one specific thing. He had given it in the only way he knew how, which was carefully and inadequately, and the boy had walked away, and the corridor was empty. He turned eventually and walked back the way he had come. The portraits watched him go. The torch near the window continued its low crackle. The corridor returned to itself, stone and draught and the smell of old timber, the same as every corridor after everything that had ever happened in one. Dumbledore walked through the empty castle toward the headmaster's office. He was 114 years old. He had time remaining, probably, to think carefully about the things he had said tonight, and the things he had not. He intended to use it. He did not expect this intention to make the use easier. 3 weeks after the emergency session, the formal record settled into its new shape. Albus Dumbledore's censure on Count 3 stood. Formal institutional finding that he had failed, as headmaster of Hogwarts, to prevent or investigate the use of a prohibited instrument on a student in his care. He remained headmaster. That appointment belonged to the school's board of governors, not the Wizengamot, and the board had not moved to remove him. He taught his classes, kept his office, and occupied a diminished position in the institutional landscape of Wizarding Britain. The Wizengamot did not govern Hogwarts, but the Wizengamot's formal censure of its headmaster was now a permanent part of the public record, and permanent records had a way of following people into rooms. The Count 1 and Count 2 inquiry concluded its initial review and issued a referral. The matter of Sirius Orion Black's imprisonment without trial was formally referred to the full Wizengamot for an emergency evidentiary hearing at a date to be set. Sirius Black remained legally a fugitive. He had not been acquitted, but his name was now on the Wizengamot's active docket in a proceeding that had never previously existed, attached to an arrest record that contained no trial record, and the file was on the docket, and the docket moved. Harry Potter's formal withdrawal had been acknowledged. His legal status, who held guardianship, under what terms, was under Wizengamot review, pending the inquiry's outcome. Severus Snape sat at his desk in his dungeon classroom at 11 o'clock at night, marking fifth-year essays on the strengthening solution, and thought about what Harry Potter had done. He had been thinking about it, at intervals, for 3 weeks. Not obsessively. He was not a man who permitted obsessions, in the sense that he preferred to complete the obsessive thought and move on, which he found more efficient than leaving it unresolved in the background of everything else. He was completing it now. He had the facts. A 15-year-old boy had woken before dawn, sat down at a desk with a quill and parchment, and written 4 pages of precise documentation that had produced within a single day, a Wizengamot emergency session, and a formal censure of the most powerful wizard in Britain. The mechanism was a withdrawal letter. The instrument was plain language. Snape had known for 15 years what could not be said in rooms that had the power to act on it. He knew the weight of information carried in silence, because the silence was the only condition under which the work remained possible. He had been carrying specific pieces of information in specific rooms for specific years and had not said them. He had protected the Potter boy across 4 years of this school from the shadows of his role, without credit, without acknowledgement, with the thoroughness of a man who has one thing of value and has decided to spend it completely. He had understood Dumbledore's method because he lived inside it. Information managed through silence, protection delivered through concealment, the fewest people knowing the smallest necessary share. Harry Potter, at 15, had done the thing neither of them could do. He had written down what was happening to him in plain declarative sentences, and sent it to the people whose institutional function was to respond to such sentences, and those people had responded, and the result was in the public record. Snape set down his quill. He looked at the essay in front of him, which was arguing, incorrectly, that the principal ingredient in the strengthening solution was valerian root. He picked the quill back up. He wrote, "Valerian root is a stabilizing agent." See page 47. He moved to the next essay. He did not allow himself, in a way he was aware of, any particular feeling about what Harry Potter had done at 15 that he had spent 15 years being unable to do. He marked the paper. Bill Weasley wrote a letter from 12th Grimmauld Place in the early morning, before the rest of the house was awake, at the kitchen table with a mug of tea going cold beside him. He kept it short. "Things are moving. I can't say more than that through this channel. Tell Harry this. Sirius heard what he did. Tell him it mattered. He sealed it and sent it with the orders owl before breakfast. Ron received it at Hogwarts the following morning, between porridge and the start of charms. He read it once, quickly, then read it again, more slowly. He folded it carefully along the original lines and put it in the inside pocket of his robes. He sat for a while with the letter in his pocket and thought about how to give Harry this information, which was not complicated to say, but would need to be said in a specific way. Not too much. Not with the performance of significance that Harry always noticed and went slightly distant in response to. Just. Bill says this. Just. It mattered. He'd say it later. He already knew Harry would look at a window when he heard it, rather than looking back, and that this was fine. Percy Weasley's desk on the 3rd floor of the Ministry of Magic had a new arrangement. The letter to his mother, the one he had written 5 weeks ago, the one that had been in the bottom drawer for 5 weeks, the one he had opened and looked at and closed again, was no longer in the bottom drawer. It was on his desk. It was still sealed. He had rewritten the first line on a fresh sheet and then put the fresh sheet next to the sealed envelope, and neither of them had been sent. This was not the reconciliation. He was 19 and in the early stages of understanding the difference between institutional arithmetic, which side was losing, and what it would cost, specifically, to have been the person who wrote that letter to Ron in September. The letter was on the desk. He had not sent it. He could see it from where he was sitting. 3 weeks after the first dawn, Harry stood at the window of Gryffindor Tower and watched the sun come up over the Scottish Highlands. Ron was to his left, red-haired and sleep-creased, leaning on the windowsill with both arms. Hermione was to his right, already dressed, holding a mug of something warm in both hands. The Black Lake was beginning to take shape below as the light returned to it, the water going from black to dark grey to the specific colour of early morning water that didn't have a name. The grounds were still. The sky was doing what October skies did, moving from dark to something orange at the eastern edge above the mountains, and they stood and watched it happen. Harry had the third copy of the withdrawal letter in his pocket. He had been carrying it since the morning he wrote it, in the inside pocket of his robes against his chest. He reached in now and took it out. It was folded in thirds, sealed, addressed to no one. His copy, the one he had made, so that one of the copies would always be his. He held it in his hand and looked at it. The seal was still intact. His name was not on the outside, because he had made this one for himself and had not needed to address it. He thought about burning it. He thought about it for long enough to know he wasn't going to. He folded it back along its creases and put it in his pocket. Hermione said, quietly, "What do you want to do today?" Harry looked out at the lake. The orange had spread further along the horizon. Below, on the grounds, something moved near the edge of the forest. A bird, probably, or one of the larger things that moved near the forest edge in the morning and didn't come closer. "I don't know yet," he said. He meant it. He was 15 years old, and 3 weeks ago he had woken before dawn and written 4 pages and sent them. And the 4 pages had moved the Wizengamot and entered a will into evidence and put Sirius's name on a docket and produced a formal record that had not existed before. He did not know what came next. He did not know what he was going back to, or what the guardianship review would determine, or what Sirius's evidentiary hearing would find. For the first time in a long time, not knowing felt like the beginning of something, rather than the continuation of nothing. He turned his right hand over and looked at it in the dawn light. The letters were still there. They had not faded in 3 weeks, or in 5 weeks, or in the month since September when the quill had first cut them. I must not tell lies. Still there, pale and permanent in the skin of his right hand, and the inquiry had been mandated, and the censure had passed, and the files were in the record, and the letters were still there. Some things that were done couldn't be undone. They could be spoken. He had spoken them. The scars remained, and so did he, at a window with the sun coming up, with his best friends beside him, watching the sky change color over a school he may or may not be returning to. He put his hand down. All was not well.